In today's lesson, we're going to be going over espresso dial-in. So we're going to be imagining that we are on the opening shift of our cafe, and we are a barista who needs to go ahead and get our espresso dialed in from start to finish. So if you hang in there with me through this lesson, it's going to be a little dense, but I'm going to try and break things down as easy as I can, and really just give you the real basics of what needs to happen. And to be honest with you, once you go through the process a couple of times, it's going to become pretty intuitive. All right, so with espresso dial-in, we really just need to talk about the basics and the theory behind it before we actually get started. So what we're going to be discussing here is our espresso hierarchy of needs. And we're going to notice that really with dialing in espresso, there's only three main steps that we need to focus on. And the first step we're going to focus on is our dose. Now, dose is the amount of dry coffee grounds by weight that we are going to be introducing into our espresso basket, right? Now, the dose or the amount of coffee that we're going to use is directly dictated by the size of your portafilter basket. Each of these baskets, for every espresso company, every espresso machine, they are designed to hold a specific amount of coffee, and that is the amount of coffee that we should be using. So, for instance, the basket that we have here does not have anything written on it, but through testing, I do know that this basket is meant to hold roughly 20 grams of coffee. Your espresso basket may be 18 grams. I've seen baskets as small as 16 grams, and I've also inversely seen them as big as 24 grams. But they are designed and engineered to hold a specific amount of coffee. Moving on from that. So that really, unless you're changing your baskets constantly throughout the process, really it's figuring out, once you figure out the proper dose for your basket, it will be that dose moving forward in perpetuity from today, tomorrow, next month, next year. So that's really the first thing we need to figure out and decide. And as I said, the way that you know that you have a relatively proper dose is after you've ground into your basket and tamped, really you should see the level somewhere around this ridge line. So there should be something like close to a 1/4 inch of headspace between the tamped coffee puck and the very top edge of the basket. So roughly a 1/4 inch. And there will be some give and take to that, but the biggest thing is that we want to make sure after we're pulling our shot of espresso and we remove the portafilter from the group head, we should not see any indentations from the screw and the dispersion screen and the screw that holds it in place. So as long as you're not seeing any markings on the top of the puck after it's been used, we should be okay. That should mean we have enough headspace in the group head. So based on that, and based on our equipment here, we can decide that we know we're aiming for 20 grams in our starting. The next thing we have to decide before we even start pulling any espresso shots is our yield. Now, yield, we're going to talk about as the weight of finished espresso. So the amount of espresso by weight that's pulled into the cup. Within specialty coffee, this is often talked about as a ratio, meaning the ratio between your dose and your yield. So, for instance, if we are pulling a 1-to-2 ratio, which is a very, very common ratio within cafes, we're talking about 20 grams of our dose to 40 grams yield, a 1-to-2. Now, if we pulled to a 1-to-2.5, that would be 20 grams starting, because that should ideally never change if we're never changing our baskets. And then we would be pulling to 50 grams out. And inversely, if we went to, say, a 1-to-3, 20 grams in, 60 grams out. Now, you may ask yourself, well, what is the point of changing ratio? And that really has to do with how diluted the final product becomes. So if we're pulling a relatively short dose, say a 1-to-2, the espresso that comes out will be relatively concentrated. It's going to be a smaller volume, but it is going to be very intense. And that can be helpful to cut through milk in, say, a larger cafe beverage. Now, if we pull say we're pulling just a straight espresso to be consumed by itself. We may want to stretch that ratio a little bit to say a 1 to 2.5. And what that can do is that can offer a slightly diluted final beverage product, which inherently is slightly easier to drink. It's less intense for the customer. And it also can help provide a slightly more complex sensory experience. With dilution, to a point, tends to create better flavor complexity and more easily perceived nuance. Much like you would see somebody who is tasting, say, a spirit like whiskey might add a small amount of water to their whiskey to taste it, because that will create a slightly more diluted beverage and it will become easier to perceive flavors. So I will say there are guardrails to an extent, but you can really push up. I've seen baristas push a yield as far as, say, a 1 to 4, meaning 20 grams in, 80 grams out. But once you hit that like 1 to 4 ratio or even further, you're really kind of getting out of the range of what espresso truly is. So like I said, a very common ratio is 1 to 2, 1 to 2.5, or 1 to 3. Somewhere within that ballpark is what we're going to be aiming for. It will depend on what your final beverage aim is and what coffee you're using in the first place. But for today's video, why don't we go ahead and stick with a 1 to 2, just to keep numbers very easy. So 20 grams starting coffee into our basket, 40 grams final beverage out. Now, the last thing we need to focus on, and the one that we will utilize actually pulling shots and tasting, is our grind pattern. That is the very last variable that we need to adjust for dial-in. So you can see out of these 3 variables, and they all build on each other, 2 of the 3 we already have decided before we've even started pulling our shots. So that should make this process incredibly easy and standardized for future replication and being able to dial in. Great. So now that we've discussed the espresso hierarchy of needs and the 3 steps we're going to be utilizing to achieve our dial-in process, it's important to also look down at this chart, which directly correlates with coarse particles, or I should say grinding to coarse, for our given ratio and our given variables that we have. And then we're going to talk about very fine particles, what we will probably perceive based on that, and what kind of characteristics we should perceive when we're properly dialed in. Now, looking at this espresso chart, we are always going to start dialing in on the coarse side of things, meaning we're going to make sure that our particles are coarser than we would necessarily expect them to need to be. And then we will start, once we've decided these 2, we're adjusting grind settings, so we'll be on the coarse side of things. We will pull a shot of espresso. We will see where it falls on this chart. And based on where it falls on this chart, we will then start moving our particle size finer. And as we do that and we keep pulling shots, we're going to very likely notice an increase in body or mouthfeel, tactile perception, to a point where we will hit the peak, the most body, and the best possible extraction that we can achieve. But we won't actually know that we've achieved it until we've gone a little too far. Because once our particles become a little too fine, we're going to notice that, there will be a decrease in body and a decrease in tactile perception. And we will be utilizing this chart along the way to follow along. All right. So now that we've discussed the theory of espresso, dialing in, we're going to put it to practice, right? So as we discussed before, we have a specific size basket within our portafilter. Here we are utilizing a 20-gram basket, so our dose should be as close to 20 grams as possible. And we're aiming for a variance within about a half gram. So if I'm at 20.5 or I'm at 19.5, somewhere within that range is totally acceptable for dialing in purposes. So to get that process started, I first need to turn on the grinder, which I have done. I have the grind setting set a bit coarser than, say, what it was yesterday. within your shop, or a little bit coarser than I would expect it to be for a new coffee, right? Now, the very first thing we have to do is we have to check our dose, meaning how much output is the grinder giving us. If you do not have a time-based grinder and you only have a grinder, say a manual paddle grinder or other types of older grinder equipment, this will be a process that you just need to do for every shot. So you would set your basket on the scale, you would tare the basket, grind into the basket, and then you would need to weigh your basket and add or subtract a small amount of coffee depending on where your ratio came out. But for our purposes, this grinder will repeatedly grind to the same dose depending on the time I have it set for. So I'm going to go ahead and check what that dose is currently giving us. So we can see on the scale right now, we came out at 21.5 grams, and we're aiming for 20. So we are a little higher than we want to be. So to help bring that dose back down into the range that we're looking for, we're simply going to subtract a small amount of time that the grinder is grinding for. So that will give us a smaller output. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I will save that. I will try one more time. We're very close at this point. We're going to subtract just a little bit more. Okay, we'll do one more. Took off just a tiny bit too much. Great. So that was step one. We decided our dose, and then we adjusted the grinder to achieve that dose. So now we should be grinding very, very close to 20 grams precisely. Okay. Now the next step in the pyramid that we referenced, right? Dose is the very first thing we have to decide. Ratio is the second, and we do that before we even start pulling espresso. And as I stated prior in this video, we have decided on a ratio of 1 to 2, meaning 20 grams of dry coffee grounds to 40 grams output of scaled weighted espresso. So that's 2 of the 3 variables we've already decided then and there. So great. The next thing we are going to do is we are going to start pulling shots in the normal preparation method that you utilize at your shop. And then we will start tasting and evaluating both flavor and the tactile sensation of the espresso. And based on that, we will then reference our chart, and that will tell us where we need to move our grind setting to achieve the kind of flavors that we want. So always looking for a clean and dry espresso basket. We'll go ahead and start this process. Great. I myself, in a normal workflow setting in a cafe, I tend to just very gently hold the portafilter and use my other hand to tap the side of the portafilter. And we are simply trying to spread out the espresso as evenly as we can within the basket. Once I have achieved that, I'm going to utilize my tamper to compress the espresso. Wonderful. We have achieved a level, compacted espresso. All that's left to do is to go ahead and start pulling our shot. Great. And we will pull this espresso until we reach our desired weight of 40 grams. Good, very close. Now, one small aspect that I really want to discuss is time, the amount of time that the shot takes. I want you to realize that that is not the target. It is simply a secondary reference that we will use moving forward to keep track of what's really happening with our espresso. Now, this espresso in the grand scheme of things, comparatively to when it will be dialed in, started relatively quick. The water passed through the coffee quickly, and we were able to achieve our final beverage weight of 40 grams in 18 seconds. In the grand scheme of espresso, that's pretty quick. So I can tell, if you think of the analogy of two cups, one full of large pebbles and one full of sand. If we are pouring water through both of these, which one do you think the water will pass through more quickly? Right? The pebbles, obviously. So that can help tell us that our particle size is too large. The water is passing through too quickly, and we can probably confidently tell, based on how quick this ran, that this shot is what we would call under-extracted. I'm going to give this a small stir. Whew. Okay, let's come back to our chart and reference what I'm perceiving and what that can tell us. So this shot is exceedingly sour. It's lacking sweetness. It does have a very quick finish, and the tactile sensation is very low. So all of that leads us to the assumption that our particle size is too coarse. So we are way down in this lower quadrant of the pyramid. We want to move way up. So how we achieve that is by moving from coarser particles over to finer particles. So that tells us that we need to make a grind setting adjustment. And that's easy enough to do. So I'm going to, obviously, remove my used puck. Always rinse between every shot. Please and thank you. Okay. So on our grinder, Malkonig Peak, which is a very common grinder within the industry, it has a numerical value system, 0 to 10, 0 being the finest possible setting, 10 being the coarsest possible setting. So we are currently just slightly over 5. As we stated, we want to move to a finer or smaller particle size. So we are going to make an adjustment down. When your shot is very far out of what your ideal spec is, we can assume that we can make larger adjustments to start with until we get closer. And the closer we get to the actual ideal espresso, the smaller and smaller and smaller our adjustments need to become so that we don't accidentally constantly overshoot what our peak extraction is. So at this point, I'm going to move us down from 5 down to the number 4. Great. I've made the adjustment, but remember, your grinder may have a small amount of the previous grind's particles trapped within it. So it's always a very good idea to rinse your grinder or grind a small amount of fresh coffee through at your new grind setting. Does not need to be an entire dose, but we're just going to go ahead and flush that through. So we have not changed our dose, meaning the amount of particles, the amount of coffee going into the portafilter, and we are not changing the yield, the final weight of espresso coming out. We are only changing our particle size. And remember, based on that stack of pyramid, if we were to adjust one of the lower variables, meaning our dose or the yield, we would need to readjust grind setting accordingly. So that's why when you dial in service for the morning, I really suggest keeping the lower two variables, your dose and your yield, locked in and only make adjustments to your grind setting. Okay, let's go ahead and try this new particle size. Great. Once again, simply holding the portafilter relatively loosely, using the other hand to gently tap so that your espresso bed levels out nice and evenly. Great. Now we're going to go ahead and tamp. Wonderful. And we will come back to pull another shot of espresso. Great. Now, based on the adjustment we made, that shot did take a slight bit more amount of time, but that is to be expected. As our particle size gets smaller, the water has a harder time moving through the coffee bed, so it will slow things down slightly. Okay. Based on that, it is still slightly sour. It does have a relatively quick finish. And the biggest thing I would point you to pay attention to is the tactile sensation. That is the easiest thing to perceive throughout espresso dial-in. So for me, this tactile sensation, I would say like 1% milk. It's there, but it's kind of thin. It's not heavy. It's not weighted. What we're ideally looking for is like at the lowest tactile sensation, you would say watery, then you would move up to creamy milk, then you would move up to say pure maple syrup, then we would move up to Mrs. Butterworth's table syrup, right? Cough syrup, incredibly thick mouth coating at the most ideal extraction. And we're not there yet. So we're gonna go ahead and make another grind setting adjustment. Once again, moving finer on our particles to help bring us higher on that tactile sensation on the pyramid. Okay, so we were at number 4, and while we did see a slight improvement, it was still relatively small, and we're still a good ways off of where we want to be for our final espresso. So I'm going to jump us down. I'm going to make a smaller adjustment than the previous one, but we are still going to make what I would consider a sizable adjustment. We're going to move down to 3.5. And just as I stated before, we're going to grind a very small amount of coffee through here to make sure that the previous particle size is completely out of the grinder. Great. One other key point I would note is along this way, as we start grinding finer and finer, the coffee moves through the grinder slightly slower every time. So depending on how far you've moved from your original check on your dose, a full 1.5 to 2 number finer on your grind setting may be worth double checking your dose at this point, which I'm going to do to make sure that we're still around that 20 gram range. We're at 19.4, so we're still very close to where we wanted to be. I am, however, going to make a very small adjustment to make sure that we are back staying within that 19.5 to 20.5 dose that we talked about. Great. So, made that adjustment, made that grind setting adjustment. Now we're going to pull another shot. Okay, we'll go ahead and start our next shot at the smaller grind setting. Great. Now, this shot, looking at the time that it took to reach our desired weight of 40 grams, that went from like 19 to 20 seconds from our previous shot This one went up to 24 seconds. So we saw a decently sizable change in the amount of time it took, meaning that the change in particle size is now having a bigger effect, right? Okay, so we're getting to the point where the sourness of the espresso is definitely toning down quite a bit. I am starting to get more sweetness. I'm starting to perceive deeper tones, think like nuts, caramels. Not anything too deep or dark though. I'm not really getting any like heavy chocolate or anything else like that. And the next thing I would say is the body, the tactile sensation. This was definitely improved, or a higher level of body or tactile sensation. I would put this closer towards maple syrup. It's there, but it's still somewhat thin. But it does tell us we are still moving up the pyramid. We have not reached the peak of extraction yet. So I always teach people, go a little finer. If you're unsure, just keep going a little finer with your grind setting, because eventually you will get to a point where you are strongly perceiving bitterness, and you will be able to notice that tactile difference. You will, oh, my last shot was thicker. And that right there will tell you that, oh, my previous shot was probably at a better grind setting for the variables that we're utilizing. So, as I said before, the closer that we're getting to our desired shot or extraction, the smaller our grind setting should become, or the smaller changes our grind setting should have. So we're at 3.5. Now I'm only going to move us down to 3.25 so that we don't accidentally overshoot where we're trying to get to. Once again, we're going to grind a very small amount of coffee through the grinder to make sure that the previous particles are rinsed out. We're going to pull another shot. Remembering to keep all our other variables the same, right? Our dose, our yield, your preparation method, clean and dry portafilter. We want to keep all these variables the same so that we know the only thing that's affecting our perception of what's happening in the espresso is the one variable that we want to change, which is our grind setting. Everything else should be kept the same throughout this process. Okay. So that shot took just a little bit more time, as we would expect, as we keep moving finer on our particle size. Definitely smelling more sweetness. Yep, tasting more sweetness. There's more balance, there's more fruit, but there's also becoming caramel tones to give that brightness balance. Starting to get hints of a little bit of chocolate, and the tactile sensation is definitely improving. It's getting thicker and heavier. This is slightly above maple syrup. I wouldn't say it's Mrs. Butterworth's by any means, but it's lingering, it's slippery, so we're on the right track. We're not quite at our peak extraction, but we are getting closer. And once again, to remind everyone, how do you know that you've gone too far? You will start to perceive bitterness, and you will notice that the tactile sensation has actually decreased from your previous shot. That's how we know we've gone a little too far. But we don't know that we've gone too far until we do go too far, at least one shot. Okay, so we're at 3.25. I'm going to push us down close to 3, and we'll see how that turns out. We're going to rinse our grinder slightly. Great. And we repeat the process again. Now, please keep in mind, we're moving very slow in this tutorial. And I definitely started from a very exaggerated grind setting on the coarse side of things. In practice, in a cafe setting, from day to day, this process should be able to be achieved in about 3 shots, because your grinder will probably be left at the setting that you were using the day before, right? And when I say moving coarser to start the dial in, I'm not necessarily saying you need to move 2 to 3 numbers coarser. If you were at a 3 yesterday and that was where your peak extraction was happening, you may only move to 3.5 and then back down towards that desired point. It does not need to be a very exaggerated process every day. And you'll notice I'm paying very careful attention to being very gentle when I'm locking the portafilter into the group head. If you accidentally bang it, you may disturb that prepared puck of espresso, and that will cause all sorts of issues for you. So we want to be very gentle when we are locking the portafilter in position. Great. One thing we are starting to notice is that it is taking longer for our stream and our drips to start. They're starting to come out more like warm honey, which is something we're looking for, ideally. We're noticing this process is taking more time. Great. We're getting close to 30 seconds, which, as I said, time is really just a secondary reference. It is not a target. We are not aiming for a very specific time, but there is a window, right? For a very standard espresso shot of this style, we would ideally be looking for a finished espresso between 25 seconds to as far as, say, 40 seconds. And you will, if you're using an incredibly light roasted coffee that needs to be ground very, very fine, you may even go past 40 seconds to achieve proper flavors and extraction. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, a very heavy dark roasted coffee will probably need to be ground pretty coarsely to avoid the heavy bitterness. So that shot may move very quickly and may be closer to that 25-second range. Okay. Well, once again, I would not classify that as an incredibly thick shot, but I'm also not perceiving any bitterness yet. So, per our instructions, we keep grinding finer until we perceive bitterness, and then we back up just a little bit. And that's how we know that we've reached our peak extraction. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to make another adjustment, finer. You may also start to perceive that the actual color of your finished espresso starts to become darker as well as we move finer. And that simply means that we're pulling more of everything out of the coffee. More color, more flavor, more aromatics. Okay, well, I'm definitely starting to perceive some bitterness now. So that tells us that we have crested over the peak of the pyramid and we are now moving back down the other side of it. Now, the other aspect of that is I can also perceive that the texture of the espresso is not as thick as my previous shot. So those are really the two main things to be checking for. Main thing is body. That's going to be the easiest thing for you to perceive. And then flavors, right? Some people may not feel that they are able to perceive bitterness as easily as other people. But trust me, when it gets bad, you'll know. And eventually you will figure it out and you'll become, through practice, more attuned to the actual perception of the bitterness. We're going to grind a small amount through the grinder again. And remember, at this point, we went too far. I was getting bitterness. The perception of body was lower than the previous shot. So that told us our grind setting got too fine. So now I'm just backing up to where my previous grind setting was. Somewhere right, just a crack hair over around 3. And then lastly, one more time, just for posterity, I'm going to double check our dose and make sure we're still within that half-gram range of 20 that we want to be. We still are. That's great. Okay. And all that's left to do is to pull one more shot to double check that we are at the best possible extraction for this coffee, for this machine, for this preparation method. Wonderful. No bitterness. The tactile sensation is wonderful. It's big, it's heavy, it's mouth coating. So that slight coarsening of the grind setting brought us back up to the top of the pyramid, right where we want to be. So in a nutshell, we started coarse, we kept moving finer on our grind setting until we started to perceive bitterness. And we noticed that the tactile sensation had been going up and then it went back down a little bit. So we had crested over the top of the pyramid. We then moved coarser. We moved back one step on our grind setting. And that brought us back up to the top of the pyramid for extraction and for perception of body. And it's creating this really lovely balance in the espresso. So overall, I would say that I'm very happy with where we just ended up with this grind and this espresso. So there's really nothing more to do aside from possibly you could, with a eraser marker or a Post-it note, you can write on there what your dose is, what yield you're aiming for, and what your current grind setting is so that other baristas who may be working with you can follow that preparation for the rest of the day. And that's all I have for you on this one. So Hope that made sense to everyone. I hope you could follow along easily, and I'll see you in the next video.